As I sit in front of my computer, trying to figure out how to tell my story, I realize that no one will believe a word of it. I know I didn't believe it myself when I first heard about what happened to my father. But the more I pondered his story, the more convinced I became that it must be true. Nevertheless, for a long time I doubted whether I should tell it to anyone else. Although I was sure his story would be rejected from the doorstep, I pondered whether it was worth writing it down. Eventually I came to the decision that, if for no other reason, it would be the only way for my children to know just a little bit about their grandfather. I love my dad and still miss him today, 7 years later. It all started 9 years ago, but for the purposes of this story, I'll start with a visit to the bank. The bank manager left me to cool off in one of the bank offices. He was busy instructing the bank's attorney to confirm the court's decision to declare my father dead. While I waited, I pulled out and reread the note delivered to me a week ago with the safe. It was in my father's handwriting, but only the name of the bank was written on the piece of paper. Nevertheless, it was the only message I had received from my father in the last 7 years. By court order, I was gaining access to my father's safe deposit box that I didn't even know I had. I can't believe it's been 7 years since my father disappeared. Some people think he was murdered. Some are sure he died in an accident and his body still hasn't been found. Others are sure my father ran away to escape his ex-wife. This is the most ridiculous of all the theories. My father loved his ex-wife with all his heart. I couldn't imagine him running away from her. But to tell you the truth, I had no idea what happened to my father. He just seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. I guess I should introduce myself. My name is Jake Stanton, and my father's name is Mike. I'm here at the bank today because of two events that happened one day apart. 1 week and 1 day ago was the 7-year anniversary of my father's disappearance. This meant that my father's inheritance could finally be bequeathed. The second event occurred the day after the 7th anniversary. A key to the safe deposit box was delivered to me with a note from my father. As I mentioned, he had rented a safe deposit box at a bank I didn't even know about. It was 3 counties away. The reason for the delay in visiting the bank after receiving the key to the safe deposit box was the need to submit the relevant documents from the court. I am now sitting in some manager's office while they check these documents. I must confess that I am curious to the extreme as to what my father could have left in this mysterious safe. I already know that my sister and I are the sole heirs to my father's estate. I resent that my sister, Tanya, is acting as co-trustee of my father's holding. She betrayed our father and now she's making noises about forcing the sale of the ranch. I don't even know if she can force a sale or not, but it worries me. I learned from my attorney that once the IRS gets involved, the sale of the ranch will likely be forced. Even though it's not Tanya's fault, I'm still mad at her. My sister and I never got along. To her, I was a stupid little brother. She was 2 years older than me and treated me like a retard. Tanya always made fun of me in front of her friends. When it finally came to me that we were not going to be friends, I started to take revenge for all her offenses. One day, when I was 9 years old, Tanya invited her girlfriends over for a sleepover. She told them that she had seen me naked and I had a little willy. All Saturday they called me Willy and held their thumb and index finger half a centimeter apart. Then they would laugh hysterically. I was turning bright red. Saturday night the girls changed into their pajamas and talked until late at night. When they finally fell asleep, I snuck into Tanya's room and sprinkled itching powder on their change of clothes. I also put an extra dose on the clothes my sister had laid out the next day. The next morning they had breakfast and watched TV, after which they got dressed. They planned to go to the mall and meet their friends. But no sooner had they left the house than they started to itch uncontrollably. My mom was really mad at me, but my dad thought it was funny. The girls were ordered to go to the shower and their clothes were re-washed twice. When they got home, they were still itching. You'd think my sister would take that as a warning and leave me alone. But she never did. We went at each other again and again. And I realized that everything they say about women is true. They are much more devious than men. Both my sister and my mother proved it to me. My sister became much more cunning when she threw her punches at me. Sometimes I couldn't catch her for a month or more. And I'm not one for subtlety. One day Tanya took my pet lizard and put it in Mom and Dad's bed. Mom had a cow and I was being punished for not securing the latch on my pet's cage. Actually, at first I thought it was my fault. The latch on the cage was flimsy and required a lot of pressure to secure it. I probably never would have guessed if I hadn't seen my sister smirking while I was being yelled at. In retaliation, I dropped a cockroach on her back. I still smirk when I remember my sister screaming as she undressed in the yard to get rid of the insect. I was grounded for a week, but I grinned every time my sister walked past me. I learned about how incredibly conniving women can be from my mother. The way she treated my father at the end of their marriage turned me off women for a long time. It wasn't until I met Jenny that I began to trust women. But even then, my fear of betrayal almost destroyed my marriage. I loved Jenny with all my heart and soul. And despite my fears, I asked her to marry me. She agreed unconditionally. But the distrust my mother had instilled in me began to drive a wedge between me and my wife. Finally, desperate, Jenny came to my side. "Jake," she said to me one day, "we need to talk." My heart jumped to my throat. I was sure it was in this speech that I would learn that my wife had found someone else and wanted a divorce. At that moment I was about to hate her. "What exactly do we need to talk about?" I asked with a calmness I assure you I didn't feel. "You drive me crazy by constantly testing me," she said absent-mindedly. "If you can't trust me, there's no future in our marriage." This accusation stunned me. I thought I was so elusive that Jenny couldn't possibly know I was testing her. But then I realized she was right. Our marriage was hanging by a thread. I also knew I only had two choices. I could deny that I wasn't constantly checking up on her, or I could admit it and explain it. Thank God I chose the latter. "You're right," I said quietly. "I'm all messed up. My mother cheated on my father, lied to him, and then left him to be with my father's worst enemy. You've seen my father, he's a broken man. He tries to hide it, but he is desperately unhappy. Jake," Jenny said lovingly, "I'm not your mother. I would never cheat on you. But we need to find a way to put your fears behind you. Would you like to come to counseling with me?" The love I saw in Jenny's eyes at that moment solved probably half of my problems. I could clearly see the love and care in my wife's eyes. I readily agreed to see a therapist we knew from the hospital. Her name was Margaret Hogan. Jenny organized everything and she attended every session with me. Slowly but surely Margaret and Jenny worked through my problems. I remember one visit when everything fell into place. The doctor asked me what I was most afraid of. I answered that I was afraid that Jenny would find someone better than me. I loved her so much that I didn't think I could live if that happened. "Jake, honey," Jenny said, sliding off the chair and kneeling down beside me. Tears were streaming down her face. "If I ever lose you, my life will be over. I promise you that I will never leave you unless you tell me to leave. But please, please, please don't ever do that. I love you with everything I have." We hugged and cried for about 5 minutes or more. After we came to our senses, Margaret talked to us for another half hour. After that day, my fears began to fade quickly. I can't say that I trust her 100%. However, I will say this: I trust Jenny as much as any person can trust another person. If I had to give a number, I would say that my faith in Jenny is 99%. When I think about it, I realize that I never trusted my mother. There was always a distance between us. I was sure she loved me. More than that, I was sure she loved both of her children. However, in those days, it seemed to me that her love for us came first after her love for herself. As I said, Mom loved us in her own way, but Tanya was clearly her favorite. But that put my sister 2 steps ahead of me, but still 3 steps behind our mother. It was completely wrong. The first time I witnessed my mother's selfish behavior was the day Tanya played the lead role in a play for the 4th grade. Mom forgot about the play and scheduled a visit to the hairdresser for the same time. Mom and Dad were going to the blue and white ball at the hospital. It was one of the major social events of the year. When my mom found out about the scheduling conflict, she decided to go to her hairdresser's appointment. She could reschedule, but that would mean that her favorite hairdresser, Charles, would not be available. My mom never had any doubts about going to her hairdresser's appointments. I remember my sister peeking out from behind the curtain looking for my mom. Although we never got along, I felt sorry for Tanya that day. I could see the pain in my sister's eyes when she finally realized that mom wasn't coming. It was one of the few heated arguments I remember mom and dad having. Mom just couldn't understand why anyone was upset. Dad was so mad at her that he didn't talk to mom for days. Tanya didn't talk to mom for a whole week. Anyway, Dad could never stay mad at mom, and mom took Tanya out for a girls' day out for lunch and shopping. Without a doubt, mom was buying Tanya's love. And Tanya was completely taken by it. I kept my mom at a distance, but my relationship with my dad was built on mutual love and respect. My father also had a special relationship with my sister. He treated her like a princess, but if Tanya had to choose, I had no doubt she would choose our mother. Everything I know about the ranch I learned from my father. And my father made me love the ranch and everything about it. Like him, I started working almost as soon as I could walk. We were very, very close. The pain of not having him around is still with me today, 7 years after his disappearance. My mother crushed my father's soul and destroyed my relationship with her. I didn't speak to her for 2 years before my father disappeared, and I haven't spoken to her since. My disconnect with my mother was such that I didn't invite her to my wedding or allow her to see my grandchildren. Jenny and I have 3 boys. I believe my mother's betrayal of my father was inevitable. They came from very different families. My father was born into a large family full of love and mutual respect. My mother, Ashley Blakely, was the only child of a very successful construction worker, Jonathan Blakely, and his stay-at-home wife, Carol. My grandfather John and his wife founded this ranch. It is now the cornerstone of my father's estate. My grandfather inherited a 100-acre tract of land from his parents. My great-grandfather bought the land from a neighbor to help him during the Depression. But the land was never used. The ranch started with 100 acres of land, 10 head of cattle and 2 horses. My grandfather built their first house all by himself. They lived in a dilapidated trailer until it was finished. Gradually they rebuilt the ranch, and when my father started running it, it had a little over 14,000 acres and a little over 2,000 head of cattle. They also had 25 horses and many other farm animals. During their marriage, my grandparents had 6 children: Sam, Karen, Bobby, Kelly, Heather, and my dad. It was a loving family where everyone supported each other. It was known that if you bullied one of the Stanton kids, you had to face the other 5. As the years went by, all the children married and moved away, except Heather and my father. Then Heather was killed by a drunk driver when she was only 17. Even many years after her death, if my dad talked about his sister, tears would flow. They were very close. My father decided that he liked ranching and wanted to make a career out of it. This made both of my grandparents happy. My grandfather died of a heart attack a little over a year after my father graduated from high school. Although my father was still in college, he started running the ranch. At the same time, my grandmother began training my father in other businesses as well. My grandmother died almost 10 years after my father married. My grandfather was truly an outstanding man. In addition to the ranch, he built a feed store on another property facing one of the main roads. He then became half owner of the local drugstore. It's a long story that is irrelevant to what is happening now. Over the years he acquired several other businesses which, again, have no relevance to this story. For me, my father was my hero. He wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't rich or famous. He was just always there for me when I needed help. And he always knew what to do for me. I loved him the way any boy might love his father, and not so much his mother. However, I began to hate my mother only after she cheated on my father and left him. I said my father was not a celebrity, and in a very real sense he wasn't. But he was very famous for his athletic accomplishments. Sure, he wasn't good enough to be a professional athlete, but he was still pretty darn good. My dad was the starting quarterback at the local high school, Clifton High, for 3 years. I have no doubt that was the beginning of his ultimate marital problems. The Clifton High School soccer team was made up of local ranch and farm boys. Their reputation wasn't built on finesse, but more on brute strength. That was, of course, until my father was put in at quarterback. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 180 pounds. He didn't have a particularly strong arm, but he was fast and agile. He also practiced with his receivers for at least an hour a day during the summer. By the time soccer practice started in the fall, my father and his team of receivers were already working hard. If you know anything about elite professional quarterbacks, you know that they must have a powerful arm, be smart, tough, tall, and very accurate. I'm sure there are other qualities I've left out, but these are at the top of the list. Anyway, if you follow professional soccer games closely, you'll notice that the quarterback often throws the ball before the receiver makes his pass. My father did this with great precision. From a professional soccer standpoint, my father was too short and his arm was too weak. But what my dad had was more than enough for high school soccer. There were 2 soccer powers in our county, Clifton High School and Chester Academy. They didn't play each other during the regular season because they were members of different conferences. However, they met in the playoffs almost every year. And the difference between the 2 teams and the 2 schools was like night and day. Clifton was a regular high school and Chester was a prep school for the wealthiest people in the 5-county area. As I said, Clifton recruited players from the student body, and they were mostly kids whose parents farmed or ranched. Of course, among the students were kids whose mothers and fathers worked a variety of jobs. But the soccer team was mostly from the county's farms and ranches. Chester, on the other hand, recruited players from the 5 surrounding counties. It was obvious that they were also poaching players from areas well outside the county. If Chester wanted a child to play on their soccer team, the father would mysteriously get a job locally. The family would then move to one of the nearby towns. That's how Tucker Morris came to play for Chester. Tucker, or Tuck as he was known, started playing as a freshman at a high school 300 miles away. He was such an outstanding athlete that he led the team to the playoffs for the first time in 10 years. Tuck played both offense and defense. He was the school's quarterback and starting center halfback. The opportunity to play on both sides of the line was unheard of. Undoubtedly, that's why Chester officials were interested in Tuck. As was customary, Tuck's father got a job as a vice president at a local bank. Thus soon began the rivalry between Tucker Morris and my father. In fact, the rivalry, or should I say hatred, between them began in late summer, even before they faced each other on the soccer field. Their first confrontation happened one night when my dad and a few of his friends decided to grab a bite to eat at Rosie's Burger and Dog. It was a local hangout for high school kids. That night, several Chester soccer players brought Tuck to Rosie's. As my father once told me, it was obvious that the Chester students had been drinking and were acting rowdy and obnoxious. Tuck had always been an arrogant jerk, and he'd already decided he could do what he wanted. This generally characterized Chester students. They didn't think their shit stunk. In general, Tuck acted like a total asshole. He went from table to table, grabbed fries off someone else's plate, sipped from someone else's Coke, grabbed someone else's hat and threw it across the room. My dad probably wouldn't have done anything because Tuck was just making a fool of himself. But then Tuck decided to harass Becky Commerce. Becky was on a date with Simon Ballard. Simon wasn't a footballer, but he was a friend of my dad's. Simon was utterly fascinated by Becky, and she by him. Years later, after graduating from college, they married and had 4 children. But tonight, Tuck decided he was going to lay his hands on Becky. Remember, I mentioned all the attributes a professional quarterback should possess. Tuck had most of them. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, weighed 200 pounds, and had a cannon arm. Tuck was fast, but my father doubted his stamina. As a quarterback, he was rarely beaten. And as a linebacker, Tuck beat runners who were much smaller than he was. My father also doubted Tuck's savvy. But my father recognized that Tuck was probably smart enough on the soccer field. He had the opportunity to get a scholarship to a Division I college to play soccer. And there was a good chance he would turn pro. Simon, on the other hand, was 5 foot 70 centimeters tall and weighed only 140 pounds. Becky was a charming girl and smart as a whip. Both Simon and Becky received full academic scholarships to college. Although Becky was not an enthusiastic beauty, she had one important virtue. She had large breasts. Going around the room, Tuck finally stopped at Simon and Becky's table. He stood looking at Becky, then reached out with both hands and squeezed Becky's tits. She screamed and Simon jumped up to protect her. The contest didn't work. Tuck knocked Simon to the floor with one punch. That was all my father needed to see. He rose from his seat before anyone realized it and slammed into Tuck. They both fell to the floor, and my father managed to land 2 hard punches on Tuck's face before they were separated. Needle. To say, Tuck did not take it well that his face was ruined. Thus began the feud between them. Before school started, things only got worse. Tuck felt that my father had gotten an unfair advantage. So, in typical Tuck fashion, 3 days later he challenged my father to a duel. My father never backed down, but he agreed and arranged to meet under the bridge on Highway 1. Word spread quickly and quietly among the students. At the appointed time, at least 200 kids gathered to watch the fight. No one thought my father had a chance. Tuck was much bigger, and he had a reputation as a brawler. The thing is, Tuck was a bully. He was so much bigger than most kids his age that he wasn't used to anyone standing up to him. The fact that my father was furious made him furious. He told all his friends that he was going to beat my father to a pulp. Obviously, Tuck had no idea what my father was like. They circled around each other, and the crowd was buzzing with excitement. They all expected blood to flow. However, there was no blood. Tuck tried to overpower my father and kept throwing hay. None of them hit. My father continued to dance and Tuck began to throw harder blows. However, the more punches he threw, the more tired he became. My father just kept circling and dabbing, throwing the occasional jab. My father explained that in a fight, patience is the most important virtue. My father waited for the right moment and then, when Tuck was off balance, entered the fray. He drove his right fist into Tuck's stomach with all his might. The impact forced all the air out of Tuck's lungs, and he collapsed to the ground, panting. The fight was over. However, the hatred between them had increased dramatically. When my dad was a sophomore in high school, he found the girl of his dreams and my future mom, Ashley Blakely. At the time, Ashley's father was a small but growing real estate developer in the area. She transferred to the school at the beginning of my dad's freshman year. However, they didn't meet until my sophomore year. Of course, my future mom was partial to my dad, as he was a star athlete and one of the most popular types in school. That soccer season, Clifton and Chester were undefeated in the regular season. They met in the regional tournament final, where Chester won 31-24. Tuck passed for 394 yards. Since Clifton lost, no one paid attention to the fact that my father passed for 414 yards. Nor did anyone pay attention to the fact that Chester lost the next game and lost any chance at a state championship. My father was in love with Ashley, and my future mother seemed to have a crush on my father. Or at least she seemed to be. Then they started dating each other exclusively. But when Clifton lost in the regional championship, Ashley somehow met and started dating Tuck. Ashley breaking up with my dad for Tuck was a bitter pill for my dad to swallow. After that, my father's disgust for Tuck grew exponentially. My father didn't realize that his future wife was a totally self-centered bitch. It's funny, but even after everything my mother did to my father, I'm not sure he would ever agree with my description of his wife. In all honesty, though, most people haven't seen that side of Ashley either. When I was little, I didn't realize the distance between us. When I got older, I studied my mother and realized what she was. My mother was very clever with people. Somehow she managed to make people believe that she cared about them. In fact, my mom was always subtly shifting attention to herself. She was so good at it that people almost never noticed. My mom was the most socially conscious person I've ever known. I used to think she just loved my father. However, years later I realized that in some ways my mother really did love her husband. She may have loved my father, but she always loved herself more. It didn't hurt that my father was a highly respected and accomplished man who socialized in appropriate social circles. The first two descriptions of my father are completely accurate. However, he entered these social circles only reluctantly. Nevertheless, there were people in them whose attention my mother craved. My father did not like the social whirlwind that my mother loved so much, but he went along with it because he loved my mother. He liked to attend events that he felt benefited the community, such as the blue and white ball. Ashley was a beautiful girl and then a beautiful woman. She had stunning good looks and a sexiness that men were crazy about. While she was married to my father, rumors reached me that she was having affairs. I never knew one way or the other, and my father never spoke on the subject. However, if I had to guess, I'd say there was at least some truth to them. I had seen my mother use her wiles to get what she wanted from my father. I had no doubt that she used her sexuality with other men if she wanted something. If my mother had affairs, and I believe she did, it must have been to her advantage. She proved that during her high school years. Even though my father and Ashley were dating, my future mother found someone she thought was better, Tuck. This brought her into a higher social circle, and as a result, she left my father to be with her new love. This first breakup hurt my father, but he recovered. After the breakup, my father had nothing left to do but lick his wounds. He was busy working on the ranch and preparing for the next soccer season. This left his father no time to think about his ex-girlfriend. When the regular soccer season arrived, Chester and Clifton fans expected great things. As in the previous season, both schools went through the regular season without a loss. And in the playoff schedule, they met in the division finals. Once again, Chester came away with a 27-24 victory. Tuck gained 432 yards and won the game thanks to a Hail Mary pass in the final minute. No one seems to remember that the quarterback slipped and fell during that play. Nor do they remember that my father threw the ball 404 yards, led his team from the 2-yard line down the field, scored, and gave Clifton a 24-20 lead with less than 4 minutes left in the game. Again, no one remembered that with a minute and 17 seconds left in the game, my father led his team to the Chester 11-yard line. And on the last play of the game, my father threw a perfect strike to his receiver at the 2-yard line, but, as sometimes happens, the receiver started running before he could secure the ball. The ball was left incomplete. There has been debate for years as to whether that receiver could have made the field goal. When the ball was in the receiver's hands, there were 2 defenders behind the goal line. I tend to think he would have scored, but I'm biased. One last thing, no one brought up the fact that Chester lost his next game again. Since Ashley was still a student at Clifton, her father saw her almost every day during school hours. After the initial shock of their breakup, Dad started dating other girls. But he never found one that he had the same deep feelings for as Ashley. My father also decided that Ashley had the right to choose who she wanted to be with, so he would stick to friendships only. However, my father's hatred for Tuck continued to grow. My father's senior year was the best of his 4 years at Clifton. He was voted not only captain of the soccer team, but also student council president. At the Halloween dance, my father and future mother were the king and queen of the party. According to my father, Tuck freaked the hell out when the king and queen stepped onto the parquet for the first dance. And of course, during that dance, my father held Ashley tightly, and according to him, she didn't fight back. My father's senior year soccer season was the culmination of his athletic career. But it was that game that led to the ultimate devastation in the rest of his life. I thought about that year, and for my dad's sake, I wish things had turned out differently. This season went as all Clifton High School fans had hoped it would. Clifton again went through the regular season without a loss. Chester did the same, only defeated all opponents by at least 30 points. That year, the playoff schedule was shuffled once again. The playoff schedule was set up in such a way that both Chester and Clifton were pitted against each other in a battle for the state title. One of the reasons Chester was such a dominant team was because the coach finally decided to use Tuck as a two-way player. I have to hand it to Tuck, playing every day was very tiring. My dad always recognized that Tuck was an amazing athlete, it's just that Tuck was a shitty person. The state championship game was a huge event. Not only was the game held in a stadium in the suburbs of the capital city, but it was also broadcast throughout the state. By this time, Tuck had 20 or more scholarship offers. All of the biggest and best soccer colleges wanted him. However, he did not make a decision at any of them. There were rumors that he waited until Ashley was in college to make a decision. Hardly true, but women love the whole romance thing. From everything I'd heard, Tuck was a selfish bastard who thought only of himself. Except when it came to Ashley. But even still, I believe he would have eventually chosen the highest-ranked college that would have offered him a scholarship. Wherever he decided to go, he was arrogant enough to count on Ashley waiting for him. There was no doubt that he absolutely adored my mother, which made him perfect for her. He was a sports hero, his parents were in all the right clubs, and he seemed destined for greatness. Of all the great games my father played in his high school career, his best was this championship game. It was also the defining moment when the hatred between my father and Tuck was poured in. Concrete. We spent the first half of the game mostly on offense. Tuck and my father combined to gain 680 yards. The ground game was practically non-existent. For Clifton, it was due to the fact that the farm and ranch boys were very solid on the defensive line. For Chester, it was mainly due to Tuck's play at the middle linebacker position. For the entire first half of the game and almost the entire third quarter, college coaches must have been salivating at the prospect of Tuck playing for them. Even after everything that happened between them, my dad always said that Tuck was the best natural athlete he had ever seen. Throughout the first 3 quarters, Tuck punished my father every chance he got. This game took place before all the protections were put in place to keep quarterbacks safe. So every time Tuck would blitz, he would run my dad into the ground. But every time that happened, my dad would get up and smile at him. Eventually these smiles began to annoy Tuck, and he started hitting my father late. Most of these late hits did not result in penalties. However, one rare instance that was called cost Chester. Chester had a 4th down attempt at the 3-yard line, and Clifton decided to go for it. At that point the score was tied, 31-31. Clifton's coach decided a field goal wasn't going to help and asked for a simple pass. But Chester had everything under control, so my dad had to sweat it out. He finally found Randy Thompson in the far corner of the end zone. My dad hurriedly threw the ball and was watching it fly when Tuck hit him. My father admitted that after that hit, he saw stars and slowly stood up. When he got up, he saw a flag on the field. Tuck was penalized for unnecessary roughness. My father was elated, for his pass flew just over the top. On the 1-yard line, Clifton's coach played 3 consecutive running plays. Each time Tuck filled the gap and Clifton was only able to advance the ball a half yard. The third quarter ended before the Clifton coach decided whether to continue the game. When the whistle sounded to start the fourth quarter, it was clear that Clifton was going to make it happen. As in the previous fourth quarter assignment, the coach called for a slant pass, only this time from the other side. However, just like that one, he was fumbled. After that, my father began to flee and Tuck pursued him. I must have rewatched the movie with that play 100 times. Tuck was closing in on my father, and just when it looked like there was no way my father was going to be killed, he turned and ducked. Tuck's knee grazed my father's helmet and he fell in agony. Somehow my father stayed on his feet and ran into the end zone. No one realized it at the time, but Tuck's knee colliding with my dad's helmet caused significant damage. As a result, Tuck sat out 2 games and then returned to the game. But it was obvious that he wasn't as mobile as he used to be. After the final touchdown, the defense tightened up and the only scoring was a Chester field goal. However, with almost 9 minutes left in the game, neither team could play conservatively. The next time Clifton had the ball, my father began to tear Chester's second team apart. But then one of his passes was intercepted at the line of scrimmage and fell into Tuck's hands. Tuck immediately rushed down the field, and it looked like he was in no danger. But my father was behind him in a flash. An uninjured Tuck could have made it, but because of his sore knee and the perfect angle my father chose, there was a hard collision at the 20-yard line. My father not only caught up with Tuck, but pounced on him. He threw himself at Tuck's feet. And when they fell, Tuck shattered his ankle and lost the ball. Now Clifton had the ball, and Tuck was out of the game. From that point on the game was no more. Clifton scored again and the final score was 45-31. This was the first and only state championship to date for Clifton. As was the custom at Chester Academy, now that Tuck was of no use, his father was let go. This was right after his son's graduation, so as not to arouse suspicion. Of course, it caused bewilderment, but no one did anything about it. Tuck's father traveled west and found another job in California. All the colleges that were buzzing around Tuck were dwindling until there was only one left. Northwestern was willing to give Tuck a chance. But he had to start as a player. If he made the team, he would get a full scholarship. Tuck rehabbed his knee and ankle, but he never regained his former ability. He didn't make the Northwestern team. By that point, my dad had stopped following Tuck. Besides, Ashley was back in his life. Ashley practically dumped Tuck a month after the state championship game. She was sick of his sour mood and the fact that he couldn't do anything because of his injuries. It was a month or two after that before my dad and her got back together. They dated while my dad was getting a 2-year degree in animal science at a local college. Ashley, on the other hand, went to State University but dropped out her freshman year. All her life she was a big fish in a small pond. The university, on the other hand, was an ocean of students, and she was a minnow. Anyway, my mom and dad got married a month after graduation. Soon after, Ashley got pregnant with my sister. I was born 2 years later. From what I understand, for the first 14 years he spent with his wife, my father was extremely happy. I never knew how my mother felt about the marriage. She flared up and cooled down. Besides, as I already knew, it was all about her. What really kept the peace in the family was that my father did pretty much everything my mother wanted. However, he would put his foot down when she pushed too hard. But then Tuck came back to town. Tuck's father, as I mentioned, went to California. At first, Tuck's father found work at another bank, but quickly switched and became a stockbroker. He excelled at that and then moved to a bank holding company. He rose through the ranks in that group and then started his own holding company. Using the knowledge and contacts he gained, he began acquiring banks in our state. When Tuck returned, he worked for his father. Tuck was named executive vice president and was in charge of the banks his father owned in the southern part of the state. There were 9 banks in all. For the first 18 months nothing changed. However, my mother paid attention to him whenever Tuck's picture appeared in the newspaper. As I found out later, Tuck was desperate to be reunited with my mother. Despite this, my father made him work 10 hours a day restructuring the banks they had acquired. Once the banks were finally settled, Tuck began seducing my mother. It was a short-lived campaign. My father, trusting soul that he was, didn't mind when Tuck asked my mother to co-chair the blue and white ball. I later learned that my mother started sleeping with Tuck after the first week. They continued to meet in secret because Tuck was married. He had a beautiful wife and 2 children. My father was very trusting, but only up to a point. Eventually he became suspicious, and although it must have been killing him from the inside, he hired a private investigator. It didn't take the investigator long to get the evidence. You'd think there would be an uproar against Tuck and my mother, but there wasn't. Sure, people felt sorry for my father, but they didn't stop talking to Ashley and Tuck. And once my father shared the evidence with Tuck's wife, she divorced him. I assume the divorce cost Tuck a tidy sum, but I never found out exactly how much because the agreement was sealed by the court. She took the 2 kids and moved out of state. As far as I was able to find out, Tuck had very little involvement with his children. He was a selfish bastard. What I remember most is the confrontation between my father and mother. I can't get that image out of my head and can recite the conversation almost word for word. My mom picked us up from school, and when we got home, my dad was sitting at the dinner table. Dad looked at Tanya and me and said, "Kids, go upstairs, I need to talk to your mom." Tanya glanced at her father, then at her mother, and rushed to her room. I pretended to go upstairs, but I snuck back and hid at the foot of the stairs. Dad tossed some pictures in front of Mom. "How could you do this, Ashley? Does our marriage mean nothing to you?" Mom looked at the pictures and sighed. "I'm sorry you found out this way. Tuck wanted to wait until he had a deal with his wife before I talked to you." But it looks like that's not going to happen. To answer your question, I will say that our marriage meant something, but it's over now. It's time for both of us to move on. You always knew I loved Tuck. Then why the hell did you marry me? My father's voice was calm, but I could see the pain in his eyes even from where I was hiding. I loved you, but I love Tuck more. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. My father sighed and shook his head. The devastation I saw in my father's eyes lit a fire in me. If I had been asked before that day if I loved my mother, I would have said, of course. And up to that point, I had indeed loved her. However, my love for her paled in comparison to the love I had for my father. And at that very moment, all my love for my mother faded and died. Great, I guess we should discuss the details of your divorce. I heard a detached voice from my father. I was surprised. I couldn't believe how calm he was about his wife's ultimate betrayal. What do you want? Mom looked at Dad as if he should already know. I want half. This is a no-fault state, and I'm entitled to half of everything, including the ranch. At this point, my dad did something that completely surprised me. He chuckled. That's not going to happen, Ashley, he said calmly. Obviously, you've been using Tuck's legal hell. I looked it up on the internet, smartass, my mother hissed. I'm entitled to half of everything. Oh, you're absolutely right, this is a guilt-free state, my father smiled. And you're absolutely right that you're entitled to half of everything I own. The only problem is that I don't own anything. The ranch, all the equipment, all the other businesses, all the cash belongs to the trust. All I get is a paycheck and a percentage of the profits, if any. This was all set up after we were married by my mother. In case you haven't realized over the years, she never liked you, and she was only polite because of me. Anyway, if you were hoping for a big score, it's not going to happen. I saw my mother's face tense up. Then a nasty smile appeared on it. Okay, if that's the way you want to be, the lawyers will handle it. Besides, Tuck is rich enough to take care of me without any help from you. I'll just take the kids and leave. I kept a low profile the whole time, but my anger grew as I watched my mother destroy my father. When she threatened to take Tanya and me away, I lost my temper. I jumped out of my hiding place. You bitch! I yelled to my mother, running into the room. Jake, don't talk to your mother like that, my father said in complete surprise. Neither of them even suspected that I had overheard the whole thing. My mother was clearly more shocked than my father. Dad, I've always done what you told me to do, I said in a shaky voice. But today I want to give my opinion, and I don't care if you like it. My father was at a loss for words when I turned to my mother. That's when I saw the pictures of her fucking Tuck. In one of them, semen was dripping down her leg. I was disgusted. I called you a bitch, and I'm sorry, I said, lowering my voice and pointing at the pictures. You're not a bitch, you're a fucking whore. What is that disgusting stuff running down your leg? My mom recoiled as if someone had slapped her. She looked at the pictures, then at me. My mom at least had the decency to look embarrassed. I was surprised to see her tears start to flow. Finally, she managed to shake off the shock. Jake, honey, you need to go upstairs and let your father and I finish our conversation. This has nothing to do with you. I don't take orders from fucking whores, I said with pure hatred in my eyes. My mother's facade began to crumble little by little. Thinking back on that moment, I realized that it was the first time she had ever shown any emotion toward me. Apparently, on some level, she still loved me, but I didn't care right now. It never occurred to her that one of her children might object to what she wanted to do. Now she was facing the devastation she had caused to her own son. I saw her pain and I was glad. Mom, I have absolutely no respect for you, I raged. In fact, I hate you, and the sooner you leave, the better. I could never live with you and that asshole Tuck. I want you to know that as far as I'm concerned, my mother died today. Jake, you don't mean that, Dad said, putting his hand on my shoulder. Jake, honey, my mom said, deeply upset, just because your father and I won't be married anymore doesn't mean I don't love you. I told you I don't have a mother, the anger was still bubbling inside me. She died today. I pulled away from my father and started to walk out of the room. Then I stopped and turned around. I'm never talking to you again, and I don't want you to talk to me. It's over between us. I left the room and went up the stairs. But as I walked, I heard my mother sobbing. I looked up quickly and saw my father putting his hand on her shoulder. I'm sure he doesn't mean it, Dad said, trying to comfort Mom. I'll talk to him tomorrow, when he's cooled down a bit. In the morning, my father tried to talk to me, but I wasn't interested in finding out about my relationship with my mother. I said what I wanted to say and meant what I said. In my mind, she was never there for me, so it wasn't a loss. And now, after all these years, I still haven't talked to her. The divorce went through, and my father's assessment was correct. My mother had damn few rights. But bitterness overwhelmed my father toward his ex-wife. For the few things my mother was entitled to, my father fought her. Eventually, when the lawyer's bills began to exceed that amount, my mother gave up the fight. It was one of the few happy days for my father. Tanya decided to live with my mother, and I stayed at the ranch. My father wasn't upset at first that my sister had decided to live with my mother. I guess he kind of expected it. But when she confronted him at one of the divorce hearings, everything changed. After that day, my father never spoke to or about Tanya again. I don't think Tanya was happy with life with her mother. Tanya never said anything bad about her mother, but I know she was devastated that her father had cut her off from her mother. The few times we talked, Tanya asked me for her dad to call her. But he never called. I knew both Tanya and my father were suffering, but there was nothing I could do to help them. It was more like a consequence of my mother's selfishness. When Tanya graduated college after my father disappeared, she moved back east and got married. I wasn't invited to any of these events. I didn't understand why, and it made me angry. I stopped talking to Tanya after that. Now she and I are having a disagreement over the ranch, and I'm afraid she's going to win. She wants to sell everything and I don't. It's complicated: the trust, the no will, my aunts and uncles, and my father's disappearance. I've been running everything in my father's absence. About a week after taking office, I discovered that my father's siblings had given him half of their shares a few years ago. They felt that since my father was doing all the work, he should get the lion's share. My father owns 60% of everything. Since my father has been declared dead, the lawyers have told me that if I want to keep the ranch, my sister and I will have to raise a lot of money to pay the taxes. This is the main reason my sister wants to sell everything. She and her husband don't have the money to pay the taxes. And they don't want to go into debt to keep the ranch. As for my father's inheritance, he didn't seem to have anything ready. This really surprised me because he was a meticulous planner. Everything my father was responsible for was meticulously planned. So when I found out that there was no will, I was shocked. Now the state had to step in and decide how everything would be distributed. It was a complete mess. After the divorce, Tuck and my ex-mom got married a month later. And, as befits Tuck the asshole, he bought a big piece of land right across the street from the ranch and built a huge house on it. Tuck did it so my father could see it every time he drove out the gate. When the divorce was finalized, my father went to work, as it was the only thing that brought him pleasure. When I still lived at home with him, he would sit on the porch for hours and just stare into space in the evenings. His heart was broken and his soul was crushed. And his hatred for Tucker Morris now consumed him. Worst of all, Tuck kept poking my father in the face every chance he got. There was no doubt that Tuck hated my father, and stealing his wife was the ultimate victory for him. Don't get me wrong, Tuck was head over heels in love with Ashley. But defeating my father made her even sweeter. I doubt my ex-mother felt the same way about Tuck. Tuck bullied my father so much that my father began to limit his trips to the city. He started missing all his social events. But Tuck still wouldn't give up. The only thing my father was still actively involved in was the Cattlemen's Association. It was a special interest group that defended the rights of cattlemen. My father was chairman for 2 years and was elected for a third and final term. You could only be chairman for 3 consecutive years. In his third year, Tuck joined the Cattlemen's Association. He was quickly elected to the board, so my dad had to run into him at every meeting. Tuck always took Ashley with him to every board meeting. Of course, she didn't stay, but Tuck made sure my father saw him kiss her passionately before he left. My ex-mother was here to humiliate my father, and she seemed to enjoy it. Tuck and my mother had been married for about a year and a half when things got crazy. I couldn't understand why my father was doing what he was doing. I couldn't understand my ex-mother's actions either. It was like the world had been turned inside out. Nothing made sense anymore. "Mr. Stanton," a voice intruded on my thoughts. I looked up and saw the bank manager standing next to me. "We have verified the court order, and I can escort you to your father's safe deposit box. I assume you'd like the privacy of a private room to examine the contents?" "Yes, please," I replied, rising to my feet. The manager led me to the storage room where we picked up the box and then to a private room. The room was little more than a closet, but it had a counter and a chair. As soon as the door closed, I locked it and set the box on the floor. When I opened it, I found 2 large envelopes and 1 letter-sized envelope on top of them. Opening the smaller envelope first, I found a handwritten letter from my father. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "Dear Jake, I'm sorry I left you without a word. But there was nothing I could do about it. Time was short and you were out of town. Besides, it was better that you did not know, for I am sure you would have tried to stop me. I have decided to leave of my own free will and will never come back." The other 2 envelopes in this box contain a full account of what happened to me in my last will and testament. The will is notarized and has the business card of the law firm that prepared it. When you read my story, I know your say impulse will be to think I've lost my mind. But believe me, every word of it is true. When you read this, you can assume I'm alive, but please don't tell anyone, not even your wife. Where I've gone, no one will ever be able to find me. When you read my story, you'll understand why. In the course of my story, I asked you to do a few things for me. I know it will be difficult, but I ask you to honor my request. I cannot truly atone for what I have done. But if you agree to honor my request, I believe it will help alleviate some of the suffering I have caused. I am deeply ashamed of my actions. Don't worry about me, I'm content and, God forgive me, happy with where I'm going. My only regret is that I will never see you or your sister again. I always tried to be a good father, but I know I failed and I disappeared. I want you to know that I was always proud of you and loved you as much as a father can love his son. I also loved your sister with all my heart no matter what. Even if you don't believe a word of my story, please do the small favors I've asked of you. It would mean a lot to me. I've done so much damage. I love you without words. Dad." I tossed my father's note on the counter and leaned back in my chair. I was shaken to the core. My father was still alive. Where could he have gone? In today's world, no one can hide forever. But I'd already spent a fortune on private investigators trying to find him without success. I was puzzled and troubled by my father's remorse. What had he done that he wanted to make amends for? I replayed the 2 years preceding his disappearance and could not lay any blame on him, despite all the madness that had occurred. I was overwhelmed with many emotions and thoughts. Perhaps the strongest feeling was the sheer happiness that my father was still alive. At that moment, I didn't believe for a second that he couldn't be found. I would start all over again, hiring the best private investigators money could buy. Only this time I felt they had a real chance of finding him. It really bothered me that my father felt like he'd done something terrible. I went over everything in my head again, especially the last 6 months before he disappeared. And still I couldn't remember what he had done that was so bad. I quickly looked in each of the large envelopes and then pulled out his story.